All right, next up I'm going to talk about the issue of parents' rights and some of the threats to parents' rights. And if you're a parent or if you're considering becoming a parent, this is very important. I'm first going to tell you a little story, which is a current case here in Australia. It's the case of Byron and Kira Hordyke. They're a young Western Australian couple whose names I can mention here for the first time. They have two children, aged 6 and 2, and they moved in January 2017 to apply to a foster care agency to become providers of temporary respite care for children aged 0 to 5. With 45,800 children in out-of-home care in Australia, and the greatest need being in that 0 to 1 year old age bracket, and also for the fact that many of these children come from dangerous and difficult home situations. You know, the requirement for carers like Byron and Kira with strong family homes and good community support is very, very great indeed. It's never been greater. And on all relevant competencies, Byron and Kira assessed very, very well. Very well. However, they're Christians, and they spoke quite openly with the foster agency about their faith. And over the course of those conversations, the agency decided to set them a worksheet on LGBT issues, which quizzed them substantially about their beliefs on these matters and required them to fill that questionnaire out on the subject. And the Hordykes, well, they said a few things. First, they made the point that they didn't think that this was going to be an issue, given that they wanted to provide out-of-home respite care for children in the 0 to 5 age bracket. So that's hardly going to be an LGBT concern there. However, in answering the questions, they declared that they wouldn't love a child any less because of an LGBT identity, that they would never require a child, let's say the child was with them for a long time, even though they weren't applying for that, they would never require a child to leave or do anything like that because of their LGBT identity. But they considered that the long-term placement of an LGBT identifying child, as if, you know, again, would it happen? Don't know, but it might not be a good fit. Now, bear in mind that the fostering system does that. It finds good fits for certain children and it matches up the family. So this is not unusual in any way, shape or form. But because the Hordykes made it clear that they believe that homosexual conduct and so on is sinful in accordance with the Christian beliefs of nearly every Christian, they nonetheless failed the criteria of being able to create a safe home environment for foster children on account of their religious views. That's very serious. The Hordykes have taken legal action against that agency, but the agency applied to have the case thrown out on the grounds that it was baseless. But the State Administrative Tribunal found in favour of the Hordykes, deciding that the case was not baseless, but that it should continue to court. Now that's a good outcome. That's a small win early on in the process. This case is going to go to court, and this case matters. And it matters for a couple of reasons. It matters firstly because Christians have historically carried a great deal of the charity around such things as foster care. This case would mean that Christians are effectively unsuitable candidates to continue to do that into the future. It would set that kind of precedent. But also, it would set the precedent that says that basic Christian beliefs make a home unsafe for children. And there's very little difference in my mind between saying that someone's home is unsafe for foster children and saying someone's home is unsafe for children, full stop, their own children, for example. And you say, oh, well, that would never happen. And I say, well, actually, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of worrying movements in the world of policy and law, which are closing in slowly on parents' rights, particularly the rights of Christians with traditional Christian beliefs. This is a key reason, for example, why we oppose so-called conversion therapy legislation, LGBT conversion therapy. It's currently being considered by state governments right around the country. And the problem, firstly, is that conversion therapy is not our word. It's not a religious word, it's not a Christian word, and so it's very hard for us to know exactly what's being spoken of when that word is used. And it turns out it's not just anything that's coercive or abusive or in any way, you know, outrageous like that, which of course everyone is completely against. But in fact, it could include anything that would carry the suggestion that a person's gender identity or sexual orientation is anything other than a one-way street, that someone can go from straight to gay or they can go from cisgender to transgender. If you suggest that they can come back the other way, or that maybe moving in that direction might not be right for them, then that could be considered conversion therapy. It could include prayer, Bible reading, responsible medical care. You think of a psychologist seeing a child who reports gender dysphoria, but the psychologist knows there's something else going on. For example, they might be suffering some kind of mania or depression. There might be underlying issues to solve before you put the scalpel in the child's hand. Or it could include preaching. It could include counseling. Preaching, for example, anything from the Bible, which says, you know what, acting on these desires is not what you should do as a Christian. Conversion therapy, that's what they would say. But importantly, it could include also parenting. And I say that because I've read a number of the policy documents, and one of the worst that I've seen is the Australian Labor Party's national platform from 2 years ago, which was subtly modified after an ACL campaign exposed what was written there in that platform. And their policy statement literally said that claims that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can change, that is to say, could change from being transgendered or homosexual to something else. And by the way, it's not just Christians that think that. I mean, the LGBTQ community, queer questioning, believes the same thing, that there's a fluidity about these things. But nonetheless, if anyone claims that from a Christian point of view, then that should not be permitted, said the Labor policy. And importantly, if that happens in the family home, the policy literally said that the parents should become domestic and psychological abusers of their children, or should be deemed as such. That's extremely serious. And these sorts of policies, with wide-reaching effects, with ill-defined senses of what might amount to conversion therapy, but including definitely some of the things that I've mentioned at least, these kinds of things are being proposed with zero evidence that any children are being harmed in family homes on this basis, and actually no evidence that coercive or harmful or otherwise abusive practices are taking place in Australia today. Zero. None. The worst anyone could point to is voluntary counselling or requests for prayer and things like that if somebody asks for it. Or indeed a preacher in the pulpit, maybe reading 1 Corinthians 6 or something like that. That's the worst they can point to. Or a parent, indeed, who says, do you know what, we don't want Johnny to be Sally just yet. We would rather take this journey with him and see if he grows out of this. And in 70 to 80% of cases, children do. That's the true nature of conversion therapy. It goes to the heart of the family and seeks to break it apart from within. That is why cases like the Hordykes case are so important, because there's another front on which parents' rights are being undermined. This is a new frontier. It's something I raise for your information. But see, just as we've had a small win in relation to the Hordyke case, where the court will hear that case and says there's a basis for that case to proceed, so there's been a small win in relation to conversion therapy. In Queensland, the government had drafted some legislation which was to go through, but of course there's been a parliamentary committee into the legislation up there conducting an inquiry, and 1,100 ACL supporters wrote into that committee and raised your concerns. Your concerns were mentioned in the committee's final report, along with some very high-profile concerns from the AMA in Queensland, who were concerned about the ability to provide medical care under this legal framework, but also from the Queensland Law Society, who raised concerns about enforceability of these laws. And as a result, that parliamentary committee which conducted the inquiry has recommended that that bill at least be significantly changed. And that is a significant step of progress. And so what we need to do as people who care for the integrity of Christian families and understand something, which you know, I'm so grateful that I grew up in a Christian family, greatest blessing of my life. And I'm sure there's teeming thousands of Australians who believe exactly the same thing, to preserve that environment without the long arm of the government getting involved. It's so important that we respond to these calls to action and support the good work that is taking place to protect our parents, protect our children, and protect the integrity of families in Australia. Hey, one more thing. You know, I've been looking at the metrics and I figured out something. You guys are watching the videos and not subscribing. So please help us out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.